Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Survive a Molasses Flood. This is something that happened in Boston, in the north end of Boston, and it is quite a tale. And I was so surprised. Number one, when I heard of it, I was surprised I didn't know about it, but I thought maybe it was just one of those incredibly interesting chapters in history that I somehow missed. But it turns out that a lot of people have not ever heard about this terrible tragedy. And so if you haven't, if you don't know anything about it, I think you're in for quite an interesting story. And so let's go ahead and begin. Most of the information that I'm going to share with you today, I got from the internet, but the majority of it is from this wonderful book called Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919 by Stephen, I think it's Poleo. This was a fascinating read, and I highly suggest that if you're interested in what I have to present today, that you get a hold of this book, because he does a wonderful job of telling about this tragedy. He researched it and just exhaustively. And I think he's probably one of the expert people about this thing that happened. But you can also see that he has other books that he's written. And so I just really recommend him as a writer if you're interested in history. And I love the way that he portrays his story through the eyes of the people who experienced it, who survived, and those who did not survive. So at any rate, thank you, Mr. Poleo, for this wonderful book, and I hope I do it justice. Okay. There we go. So I'm going to start out with when. This happened in January the 15th in 1919. Now, 1918 and 1919 were pretty tumultuous times in the United States and in Boston, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But there was always, it seemed like there was always something going on in the headlines. So this shows you a photograph of what the North End in Boston in 1919 would have looked like. So 1919, this is about, I think, 104 years ago. And so I sort of wanted to give you an idea about what life was like then. There were lots of children working. The child labor laws had not been passed yet. So there were lots of kids doing lots of hard work for little to no pay. The families were very large, as you can see, especially when you talk about immigrants. You can see how wonderfully fashionable you would look at the beach. The women would look at the beach, as you see this bathing suit that she's wearing. Down the bottom right, you can see how football players would be attired. And there in the bottom center is good old Babe Ruth. He was still going strong in those days. And automobiles were coming along, but you would see a mix of cars, these old gorgeous cars, along with still wagons and horse travel. So the streets were very confusing and congested. And I really think this is cute. This is a mail car. It's a car, but it's being pulled by a horse, because I'm sure that a lot of the roads and places that the mail carriers had to go were probably very attuned to automobiles. So this is always fun. Back in 1918, these are some of the big things that were happening. The World War had ended, so that was behind them. But in 1918, as you can see in the top center, once again, look, we see people wearing masks and required to wear a mask, because it was the great influenza epidemic and thousands of people died. You see, this was one of the top music bands, Dixieland Jazz, Tiger Rag. just to give you an idea. Where we're talking, this place takes place in Boston, of course, in a place called the North End. And these are photographs of that area that were taken around 1900. The North End was filled with immigrants. It was a very populated, full of tenements and people, but also there was a lot of business that went on there. It's right on the harbor. So I'm going to show you today different buildings that will come into play in our story. And so first of all, we're talking about a molasses flood. Well, how can you have a molasses flood? Where did all this molasses come from? Well, you see in the photograph on the right, this huge round tank that's standing in the background. That was to be filled with molasses. It was 50 feet high, which is sort of the height of a 5-story building. It was 90 feet wide, which would be equivalent to the distance between first and second base on a professional baseball field. And it was 280 feet around. So if you were to stretch a string around it and walk around it, you would go 280 feet. As I said, it was put in the middle of a very busy business district. You can see here, number one, the arrow pointing, that is where the tank was situated. And so we're going to talk about all the other things that go on, but this is Commercial Street. And so let's look some more about some of the buildings that are around. Here again is the tank. Where you see number 2, that was the fire station. It was Firehouse 31, and it is right feet across from the tank. And then, as you can see, it's right on the harbor. They would actually have firefighting tankards that would work in conjunction with the firefighters. Then number 3, where you see there was a big paving department that was kind of like our road and works, DelDOT, that sort of thing. I'll show you a little bit more about how paving was very important back then. And they also shared the spot with the police station. You can see in the photographs, I just thought it would be interesting to see how the firefighters dressed on the top and what the police officers look like in their uniform. Then if we go across the way, you see number 4. That is a distilling company, and it is where they take molasses and they they work on it, and they begin the processing of sending it to their other distillery to convert the molasses, the sticky brown molasses, into industrial alcohol. And again, it was a very convenient place for this distilling place to be, because they're right next to the tank, which the tank is very close to the harbor. And also you will see this is a railway track, and it is up high, it's up over the buildings. So, but it would still be convenient to be a place to load up the distilled molasses onto the trains to send them off to the next stop. This big building here is a gas building. You can see here in the picture, they did not have electric lights for street lights. They all were gas related, and you can see the job that people would have to light those every evening. So this building was filled with gas. Then we have a place called Copp's Hill. It was elevated. It's on the other side of the railway. And right here where you see number 5, this was a terrace. It was built up some steps, and later on you will see how after the situation happened, how some people were able to watch the work that went on. So this was Copp's Hill, and then here is a very old burying ground. And you can see in the photograph in the bottom, that is what some of that looked like at the time. And then I believe this is the terrace in the back. And then here you have the warehouse where the tanks and barrels of molasses would be loaded off the ships and kept there to be put on ships or to be just stored. So, all right, and then over here, number 8. Now, all of this was industry, and there were warehouses, and there were all kinds of things going on for businesses, and it was very loud and constantly busy. Over here, number 8, right with the rail track running by, was a very, very heavy populated residential area. So they had lots of homes, and the people who lived there were immigrants from Ireland, but mostly from Italy. And so at that time, they were very discriminated against. A lot of them were illegal. And one reason why the distilling company was able to build this tank without any flack off of the residents was because they were illegal. They were crammed into their homes, but they certainly weren't going to complain about anything. They didn't want any attention drawn to them. You can see here the rooftops where they would be able to hang their clothes to dry. We have some immigrants sitting, and they're making lace doilies, and that was something that was very popular back then. As it says here, 95% of the Italians that were there were illegal, and they were just crammed and crowded in, very poor living conditions. All right, so this company, the company that owns this huge tank that's bringing in all this alcohol, that's doing the work of getting it, all the molasses, and that's doing the work of bringing in the and converting it to alcohol, that company was called US Industrial Alcohol. And they built the tank. They built it very quickly. And what they would do is they would have the molasses brought up from the Caribbean islands, and the huge tanker ships would bring it, they would pump it into the huge tank, and then, which would take about 24 hours actually to empty the ship. And then they would sail on and continue it all over again. So what was the big deal about industrial alcohol? Industrial alcohol was very important. Molasses itself had always been very important to the colonists. They would use it for cooking, but they would also be able to convert it into drinking alcohol. And then in the years later, they were able to distill it, and with the chemical changes that the distillation would cause, they could make this stuff called industrial alcohol, the most of which was used during the World War. They would use industrial alcohol to create explosives, sorry. And so it was very important, but the war had just ended. Now, they had been making pretty good money, but the molasses company and the industrial alcohol company were starting to feel a pinch because demand was down from the government, and right around the corner was coming prohibition, prohibition. And so you see a picture here of a group of gentlemen that are just dumping drinking alcohol out into the streets. So this company wanted to get in as much molasses as they could and get rid of it as quickly as they could, so that they could beat prohibition and just get rid of their stock that might be dwindling down. You can see that it was also used for other things, such as for an alcohol rub if you were having aches and pains in your joints, or for bathing. It was cooling, it was refreshing. So you can see down at the bottom that the US Industrial Alcohol Company, which are the people that own this tank are claiming to be the largest producer of industrial alcohol in the world. This is a picture, another close-up of that same picture that I showed you, but I wanted you to see in comparison the size of that tank in comparison to this building that is next to it. And I have the roof of that building circled because you're going to see that again later. And I just wanted to give you an idea of what it looked like on a normal day, and we'll see it again. Now, the North End Distilling Company, well, the North End itself did have a problem because of the crowdedness and the quality of life. It was a very busy port. So during the day, there were sailors, there were journeymen, there were people that were cutting stone and making paving bricks and stones and things like that. But here was this huge tank that had been there for about 5 years. And actually, it had lots of seams and it had rivets that held it all together, but it had been built very, very quickly. It was built in less than a year and it wasn't inspected. It was just thrown up. It was supposed to be, they were supposed to have filled it halfway with molasses to check and make sure that it did not leak. But instead of doing that, the owner decided that they would put in 6 inches of water, and if it didn't leak, then it was fine, and it was ready to accept this heavy, dark, thick molasses. So it started within the first year. This huge tank, which you just saw, started leaking. Wherever there were seams, this thick, gooey molasses would start running down the sides. And the kids loved it because they would take little cups and small buckets and they would catch the molasses. If you've ever had it, you know it's really good. It's sweet like syrup. And they'd just be delighted. They'd fill their tummies up with this molasses, and the workers that were around the tank would have to shoo the kids away constantly. But then not only was it leaking, the workers and the people around the tank who were, working with the ships and that sort of thing, every now and then they would hear these strange rumbles, rumble, especially when new molasses was added, and they would complain and they would tell the owners and the bosses, this doesn't seem right. And it would even shake a little bit. And they would say, this is not right. But the owners didn't care. They were making good money. Don't worry. That's, nothing's going to happen. So just don't complain about it. Well, it kept getting worse and worse. And so instead of the company saying, well, maybe we have a problem, you know what they did? They just painted the tank brown so that the molasses running down the side would not be so noticeable. So that was their answer. It's leaking badly. Oh, we'll paint it brown and nobody's going to notice. But still, they caulked it. They had somebody on December the 20th. He finally finished on December the 20th, and he caulked it, which is what you do. You take some kind of a thickening, hardening paste, and you put it in all the gaps, and it's supposed to harden and not leak any longer. So remember, this incident happened on January 19th. So a month before this situation occurred, the caulking had just been finished, and so it doesn't seem that it lasted very long. So, but it was still leaking, and the kids were still, enjoying the molasses coming out of it. So again, I want to show you some close-up of it, and especially if you look at this train track, remember how tall this tank is? Well, you can see how high up the railroads ran beside that. And there were multiple tracks. It wasn't just a single track, but it would be up above the houses and up above the buildings. So it was high up in the air. And it was convenient, as I said, because it was run right next to that track. And on the other side, on the right side, where you see it curves around, if you were to look down, you would see houses. So wouldn't you like to be living there with, all this noise going on, trains running, that these trains, except for the ones that carried freight, like the Molasses, the trains would run I think it was every 12 minutes, and it would be carrying workers and shoppers and things like that. So there was pretty much a constant train running on these tracks. So we have July the 12th. It's a Sunday. The huge tanker came up from the Caribbean full of molasses. And if you think about, now this is January in Boston, you know that there is a huge temperature change between Boston and the islands in the Caribbean. When this molasses was loaded on to the tanker, the temperature was about 80 degrees. And when the tanker was transporting from the boat into the huge tank, the air temperature was 2 degrees. So that was a very dramatic change in temperature from the beginning to the end of the molasses journey. And they were thinking that 2.3 million gallons of molasses was now in this tank. They already had molasses in there. They were just wanting to top it off. So this rumbling molasses that had been there for a while and was, had cooled off because it had been in the cold winter, in the metal, wasn't insulated, now has warmer molasses. Not terribly warm, but much warmer than what had been in there. So now we are talking about 48 feet 9 inches high that the level of molasses was, and it weighed 26 million tons. So that's pretty remarkable. That's a lot of stuff. So on Wednesday, the 15th, at 1919, when the tanker was filled, it was on a Sunday. Everybody was home. They didn't work on the harbor on Sunday, so there wasn't a lot going on. But Monday morning, the streets started getting busy, and people are hearing some rumbling, and but things are just going on as normal. Now we get to Wednesday. A little after lunchtime, people are now having their lunch. Remember, the caulking had been completed a month before, and the man who was the supervisor of the molasses tank, he was getting ready later in the day to begin all the paperwork and all the things that had to be done to start loading molasses into the train cars to be sent to the other processing area. And because they couldn't fit any more molasses in, it was time to get it moving on. Well, his wife wanted him to take her shopping. And he thought, well, you know what, I'm hungry. There's not much going on. I'm only going to be gone an hour. So he agreed that he would go shopping with her and that they would stop and have lunch. So they left. This time it's lunchtime, and you remember where the firehouse was, right across the street from the tank. Well, it was typical at lunchtime for whoever's on the shift to take a break. If there's not a fire, then they kind of just sit around, resting and just being prepared for when something happens. So they would usually at lunchtime, they'd play cards, they would talk. And there was a stonecutter whose name was John Barry. And he would work in one of the shacks in that same area. And it was pretty hard, work, but he's a big, strong guy. But to get a break, he used to like to come in to the fire station, talk to the guys, watch them play cards, their smoke his pipe, just a regular day. People are just quiet, nothing's going on. So the firemen who were in there were named Bill Connor, Fred McDermott, Nat Bowering, Patty Driscoll, and George Leahy. And actually, George Leahy it is said, was he decided he was tired and he was going to go ahead and get some sleep because things were quiet, and you never knew when you were going to have to jump up, slide down the pole, and respond to an emergency. So at the same time, there was a police officer named Frank McManus, and he was, walking his beat, that sort of thing. And there were set times during the day when he would have to stop, go to a police call box, as you can see pictured there, and he would phone in his report and let them know that, everything's good. The streets were busy, but for that day, it had been 2 degrees a couple of days ago. But this day had warmed up to 40. So everyone was really enjoying the warmer weather and everyone was busy. And so he had just started to give his report when all of a sudden he heard something strange, something that he couldn't believe it was what he thought it was. Meanwhile, we have a freight clerk. His name was Walter Marathu, and he wasn't on the train. He was down working in the offices, and he walked into one of the sheds, and there was a man named Ryan. And Ryan's last name is lost to history, but he was deaf and he was mute, and he was a good worker, but Walter always felt sorry for him because he couldn't talk and he couldn't hear, and he thought that must be an awfully lonely, existence. But at any rate, he'd walked into the freight shed and he was standing in the doorway, and the shed was kind of small, and so Ryan could sense that someone was there, and he turned around and saw Matthew standing in the doorway. And then all of a sudden, Ryan looks over Matthew's shoulder, and his face is horrified. Now, meanwhile, there's a train coming, and this man's name is Royal Albert Lehman, and he was a brakeman, and he was on one of those trains. It was just one car, but it was cram-filled with people who were shopping and workers that were on their way maybe to come back from lunch. But at any rate, he was standing there by the thing that you pull, the emergency brake, and he's looking out over Commercial Street, because remember, you've got this nice high vantage point, so you can look down and you can see stuff that's going on. Especially, there's a lot of activity always at a harbor. So he's looking, and he's looking at the tank, and the train is going about 15 to 20 miles, and then the train starts making this curve, which I think, if you see this green arrow, I'm thinking he must have been right about here or here at this split moment in time. So they're taking this curve, and all of a sudden, the sky seems to grow dark. And again, you can see here how the tracks looked and how they would be so close to the tenement houses and things like that, okay? So the sky's getting dark, and he's looking, and he's seeing something he can't believe. But meanwhile, this woman, 65-year-old woman, her name was Betty Clougherty, and she was a widow. It was lunchtime, and so she had lunch ready, and her daughter and her son were living with her. Actually, her son owned a club, sort of like a cigar club, where the gentlemen would come in the evening and smoke cigars and talk and things like that. Well, her son Martin had owned this business, and it did pretty well, and he had just sold it. And I told you how bad the living conditions were there. Well, he was in the process of buying a new house so they could move away. He wanted to improve their lives, but he worked at night, so he slept during the day. He'd get home like 4 o'clock in the morning, something like that. So it was lunchtime, and Bridget asked her daughter Teresa to go upstairs and wake her brother and tell him that it was time to eat lunch. And so she went upstairs to do that. Now, there's a gentleman named Flaminio Gallerani. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that very well. It's my fault. But he was sitting on his truck by the harbor. It was lunchtime. He's just minding his own business. Peter Francis, Patrick Breen, John Callahan, William Duffy, James J. Keenely, and John M. Seiberlich were working at the North End paving yard. And they were, enjoying, again, this nice weather. If you look at this very closely on the bottom, you'll see all kinds of different shapes of stones and things like that. There's flagstone, there's cobblestone. That's what these people did in the paving yard. It was very precise. To this day, their work still stands in the older districts, and it was really quite something. So what I'm trying to tell you here with all of these people, and these people were really there, this was really what was going on. But what I'm trying to tell you is that it was just another ordinary day. As a matter of fact, it was kind of a glorious day because it was warm and life seemed pretty good. Peter Shaughnessy was 18 years old, and he had just started a new job. This was his very first day as working as a Teamster, his first day. 17-year-old Eric Laird was driving for the Baxter and Oldfield Express Company, and he was delivering freight. Cesar Nicolo was a 32-year-old man who worked as an expressman or a wagon driver. This meant that he had the duty of packing, managing, and ensuring the delivery of cargo. And William Brogan worked as a teamster, which at the time, according to the author of the book, meant that he drove a team of horses to transport goods in a wagon. So again, we have a mixture of horses and automobiles. And this is a busy time of the day. There were people that were taking a lunch break, but still there was activity going on, and it was just a regular day. So on that day, January 15th at 12:41, an Italian father was up. He lived on an upper story in the tenement building, and his son, Pascal, was down below the apartment building. He was down with his two friends, Antonio and Maria, and they were home from school. They didn't have school lunches in, so they had a school that was close by. So the kids would come home for lunch, and then they would go back to school. So the kids were asked to go and gather wood for the fire. And there was a lot of wood that was around the tank. So the three kids go out, and Maria was getting in trouble from one of the guys that worked at the tank, because remember, they were always chasing kids away. And so this guy is fussing at her and all this stuff. And the boys, they didn't want to get in trouble, so that they went around to the back side of this huge tank, thinking that nobody's going to see them. But then her brother, Antonio, felt bad because he was letting his sister, get all the trouble. So he was coming around the side to come to her aid. And so he comes up, he sees her, and at that very time, remember the policeman? Remember he heard something that was strange? He heard all these pings, and those pings he thought sounded just like machine gun fire. And he thought, this can't be it, but he's hearing all of these pings, and he's on the phone right at that time talking to the office. Thank goodness, because what he said then was, send all available rescue vehicles and personnel immediately. He looked, he said, there is a wave of molasses coming down Commercial Street. At the same time, he's making that call, Maria and her two friends were swept away by a huge tidal wave of molasses. Maria was standing directly beside the tank when it collapsed. She was swept away and killed instantly. The tidal wave of molasses was 20 feet 25 feet high, which is the height of 4 refrigerators stacked on top of each other. It was at some places 160 feet wide, which would be 64 paces if you were to pace that out. It was huge. If you look at this drawing, this map, you can see how it went. Here's where the tank was, where it exploded. These buildings were demolished and debris was everywhere. Here's your train track. Here's probably where that train was. I believe it did get past it, so it made that. But a huge piece of this tank hit one of those tall columns that holds up the train track. This is what happened. The molasses tank exploded and was destroyed. The fire station, heavy, heavy, heavy damage. The police station and the paving was very, very high casualties. All these men were working there. There were places where there were basements where people were working. And can you imagine? You had no way to escape this if you were down in the basement. Number 4, the purity office was flattened. And here is the terrace. This is where people gathered once this was over and people heard about it. They would all stand here and they could see all of this devastation. They could see all of these people trying to rescue others. So there was a lot of people watching there. The gas company was damaged. Thank goodness it was far enough away. Can you imagine if it had hit that gas? I would imagine there would just been a huge explosion and so much more damage. The Purity warehouse was pretty much spared. And here are these poor, crowded people. And it was not good, especially for that sweet woman that was down in her kitchen fixing lunch for her son and daughter. This is what happened when that huge piece of the tank hit the strong trestles, the strong support to the train, the railroad track. Now, Royal Albert Lehman was a hero. He was a hero. He saw when he just happened to be looking at the tank when it went. They had just passed where the damage was going to happen on the tank. They passed it by 3 cars. If you have 3 cars, one in front of the other, that's how close they were to being taken down by this collapse of the railway tracks. Now, he pulled, as soon as he saw what was happening, he pulled the emergency cord to stop the train. The rail car tipped a little bit, but it settled back on its track. And he banged his arm really badly into the window, but he couldn't think about that then. So he jumped off the train and he looked, and there was another train on its way that hadn't gotten to the damage yet. And it was coming on fast. It was raising its speed, and he knew he had to do something fast. So he got out of the train. He hollered down to a dispatchman who could communicate and said, let them know something terrible has happened and did not let any other trains come on this line. Because remember, they were like 12 minutes, I think it was. Every 7 minutes. They would run between stations, and some of them would have 3 cars, and some would have a couple, but there were 3 cars coming, and he saw it and he had to do something. So he had to crawl over all of this rubble and wreckage. And once he got over it, remember we were talking, there are at least 3 tracks wide. He starts running as fast as he can, waving his arms, screaming, hollering, stop, stop, stop. And he just hoped that the engineer would have enough time to stop, not hit him, and not get anywhere close to this. So he saved that train from crashing. And because if that train had hit that spot, it would have ended up in the streets. And I can't imagine how awful that would have been. So he was one of the many heroes of this day. Here you can see a picture. Now, see, all of this is down. They're trying to get rid of the molasses. This is a couple of days later. They're trying to wash away the molasses with, they tried first of all with just water, but that didn't work. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but you can see how everything is leveled. And there's that train that managed to stop before it would go off the tracks. So you can see everything's flattened. This one was taken on top of a nearby building. A lot of these pictures are courtesy of the Boston Fire Department. They have really wonderful pictures with the ability to know exactly what it is that we're looking at. So this is showing the massive damage. The top of the tank can be seen in the top quarter center of the photo, just below the white building on the harbor. So I guess we're talking about here, there. That's the top of the tank. Flattened buildings that had been in part of the city operated North End paving yard are seen in the foreground. So I get, oh my, so that's completely destroyed. At the time, there happened to be, of course, now remember they're on a harbor, and there are people that are working on these huge ships. Now, the war was over, and so it happened that there were a lot of naval sailors who were working on the naval boats, taking off the weapons and things like that because the war was over and they didn't need to have them there anymore. So fortunately, they were there when it happened. They were on their boats, so they didn't get washed away or anything, but they were the first to actually come and assist with what was going on. And this is a newspaper picture of some of those guys who were so brave and helped out so much. And then quickly behind them, they got word out to surgeons and members of the Red Cross. If you look in this picture, you can see there's a Red Cross vehicle. And this roof, do you remember that one? Let's see. Now, this is one of the toughest things. Okay, first of all, I'm going to read you what part of a newspaper article that the Associated Press put out. A dull, muffled roar gave but an instant's warning before the top of the tank was blown into the air. The circular wall broke into two great segments of sheet iron. 2 million gallons of molasses rushed in a mighty stream over the streets and converted them into a sticky mess. The wreckage of several small buildings smashed by the explosion. The greatest mortality apparently occurred in one of the buildings of a city storage yard. One of the sections of the tank wall fell onto the firehouse, crushing it. This is the firehouse. This is where those guys were sitting and playing cards. Now, one of the firemen was facing the window the second that this happened. And he called out, "Run!" And they just all got up and ran toward the door. They had just put their hand on the door when all of a sudden the firehouse was knocked off its foundation by this huge wave. They were that close, and it was that powerful because they were so close, because it was only feet away when it hit. So this is the fire station. It's a 3-story fire station. This is the second story. The first story where our firefighters that I told you about were playing cards, they're down here. They're under where the firehouse has collapsed on top of them. There were 5 of them that were caught underneath. They were in a crawl space that was only 18 feet high, 18 inches high. So, and they were trapped. They had all kinds of beams and furniture and just everything you can imagine from the upper stories on top of them. And they were just trapped. John Barry, he was the stonecutter. He was pinned face down, and the only thing that he could move was his head and his neck. Patty Driscoll was the one who saw it coming and yelled for everyone to run. Bill O'Connor had a radiator, which is what they use to heat up rooms, and it's very heavy iron. And so he had been trapped by this heavy radiator. It was across his back, and it was so dark they couldn't see. It was darkness. So at first they didn't know if anybody else was down there with them. So they started hearing moans and groans, and they realized that they were there. They were in bad shape. Bill O'Connor didn't realize that he was next to Nat Bowering. He was right next to him, but he couldn't see him until Bowering made a noise. And now Bowering was in an interesting situation. He had a beam over him, but he had a small hole at his feet that went out of the building. So it was a hole in the side of the building, very small, but it's right at his feet. John Leahy, who was going to go upstairs and take a nap, was trapped under a pool table. And I don't know if you know how heavy a pool table is. It's incredibly heavy. And he was struggling to keep his head. He was down on his stomach, and he was trying so hard to keep his head up, because now the huge wave, is going down the street, but it's also going into these buildings. And so while they're under this entrapment, the molasses is starting to rise higher and higher, and they had it like up to their chins. And the way that Leahy was laying, he couldn't keep his head up. He tried and he tried. He could not finally keep his head up. This is a picture of the firefighters trying to get them out. The members of the fire department chopped and dug for nearly 4 hours. The body of George Leahy lay held down by a piano and a pool table. He died. He couldn't do it. So, known victims. Molasses is full of deadly junk. In other words, when this molasses hit, it's very thick, very thick. You can't run in it. The horses couldn't deal with it. It would knock you down. You couldn't swim in it. And as it crashed into the buildings and into everything, now all these pieces of sharp metal and wood and carts and animals and everything, pieces of the train truss, everything is being carried away by this stick things. And so people got injured just by the debris that was flowing, and people would have fractured skulls, broken backs. It was terrible. And some of them would be swept away by the wave of this thing and not found for days. And so this relief station was like the closest small hospital that was nearby. They showed up as quickly as they could. But they would load people onto stretchers as they could. But when they took them back to the relief station, to the small hospital, it was not good, because, hospitals, they want to keep it sterile. They couldn't even tell who people were. They couldn't tell if they were men or women, because their clothes were caked with this heavy molasses that hardened, and they would have to break off and cut off their clothes before they knew who they were dealing with. The molasses was dripping off their bodies and off their hair, and before long, the walls, the floors, everything in this small little hospital was caked with molasses, which was not a sterile thing to happen. And it caused a lot of infection for the people who were saved. Now, our sweet Bridget, who was in her kitchen, the building crushed, just collapsed. And you can see here, there around, that's the house she was in. It was multi-story, and her son and daughter were up. Her son, Martin, was still in bed when this thing happened. It knocked him off the bed. She was crushed by the building. And she also had a second son who had a mental disability. And I'm not sure how he was rescued, but he did survive this. But she was carried where she was just carried along with the house, and it smashed against these heavy metal supports to the railroad track and just completely destroyed. They tried to get her out. They, thought that she could be alive. Things worked out just right. And they tried a long time, but by the time they reached her, she was dead and her injuries were terrible. Her son said, it seemed as if the house had split in two when it hit the elevated structure. And I was in one side of the house and my family was in the other. And I couldn't find my mother. I shouted for her and yelled for those who had come along to the street to find her, but I couldn't locate her. Someone told me that she had been found and that she was dead. Well, Teresa actually, I guess, had made it back downstairs, and she and her brother Stephen were eating. And when the explosion hit, they were just thrown out into the street. Martin, who was, just getting out of bed, was knocked into the floor. The house collapsed, and he was being, pulled away in the street. This flood of molasses was just taking him away, and he's trying so hard to swim. But he happened to see something that looked like it could be a raft. So he climbed up on it. Here's all this debris and everything. And he realized that it was his bed frame. So he managed to ride on top of that and be able to stay out of the molasses. And he saw a hand come up from the molasses, and he went over, he was able to get over, and he pulled the person up, and it was his sister. So he told his sister to get on this raft, and he went off to find his mother. Their brother, Stephen, had survived, but he had a terrible nervous breakdown, which I can imagine. And they had to just commit him into an insane asylum where he died. This is a close-up of that picture of her house. And here you can see that is the elevated place, the terrace, where people stood and watched this horror just unfold before their eyes. Here you can see someone looking out their window. Terrible. Another picture of the house. I don't know what this is. I thought at first it was a house, but I'm sure it is not. I don't think it is. But I chose to show you this because if you look up here, what is circled, that's a bed. So it might be the house from the back direction. I don't know. I couldn't find out any information. So let's talk about the victims. According to Mr. Puleo, who again wrote this amazing story. John Callahan was 43 years old, and he was a paver. He was in that paving yard that just got smashed. He was reading his paper. It's lunchtime. He was taking it easy, taking a break, and he got carried away by the wave. But when he went below the surface, it just so happened that there was an air pocket. So he was able to get his face up in the air pocket and breathe until someone noticed his body. They took him to the relief station, and he survived for 5 days, but then he died of pneumonia and of infection. Maria, the little girl who was right there beside the tank when it collapsed, she was 10 years old, and she was found early. She was buried beneath a pile of molasses barrels. And according to the Globe, their newspaper, the day after the flood, one of the workers found her body, and with a poor little thing, she was just bruised, and it was just so sad. Her brother was also caught up in Molasses, and he was hospitalized, and he, I guess, survived, but he had told them that they were, according to him, they were returning home from school for lunch. And then the third boy, he's the one whose father was watching him at the time. He was killed. This is a newspaper article talking about it and identifying who he was. Peter Francis was a victim who died at the Release Hospital. He had to be identified by his clothing. They couldn't identify his face, so, but his son came and he identified what he was reading, I'm sorry, what he was wearing. And so he was one of the first to be taken to the Relief Hospital. He regained consciousness for a little bit, but after his son arrived, he died minutes later. Eric Laird was 17-year-old. He was the driver of the express company, and he was delivering freight at the time of the explosion. His body was found under the molasses-coated mass of the wrecked automobiles, express boxes, and packages. I mean, this thing was picking up and carrying off automobiles. I mean, they weren't as heavy as ours were now, but still, that's saying something. James Lennon was another person working in the paving department, just eating his lunch. This building that you see here in the center is the relief station where the victims were taken. And if you, I don't know if you can see closely, but if you were to look very closely, if I would enlarge this, you could see all the beautiful paving and things like that, that these guys who were, you know, in their shed working away, were working on. Okay, this is Michael Sinnott was working as a messenger for Public Works, and he had just gotten back to work 40 or 20 minutes before. So maybe if he hadn't arrived when he did, he might have been in another part of the city, but he was having his lunch. He was thrown several feet against a pile of paving stones and got a fractured skull. And he was, sadly, he was 78 years old. He was the oldest victim of this tragedy. James Mullen had injuries, and he fought so hard in the hospital to stay alive, but again, infection got him. And here's a photograph of one of the victims. He died, and his 14-year-old son was also involved, but he was just treated. Peter Shaughnessy was still missing 2 days after the disaster, and he's believed to be a victim. They never found his body, but they found his horse, and they found the wagon, but no body, so they assumed that he died as well. The day of the flood was his first day on the job. And John Sleiberlich, he would usually go to his office and take a nap. You know, he'd stay at noon, and he was in the relief station and didn't make it. So again, it was really hard for them to rescue people because the molasses was just oozing, and it was, you know, surrounding several inches deep. At some points they were up to their knees in it, and it slowly drained into the harbor, which turned the harbor brown. And the firefighters, as I told you, they turned on streams of water, but if they stood in one place too long, their feet would seem like they were glued to the ground from the hardening molasses. Here you see again, Red Cross workers, men, yes, but there were also women and girls, and they would bring, they go through and they bring coffee and donuts to the workers. And it took them 4 days to get this cleaned up. And it was a very bad thing for horses. The horses, they were knocked over, and they would try to struggle to get up. And it was like they were in quicksand, so they had to be put out of their misery. And then remember, I told you you would see this roof again. Here it is on this building, and here it is after. So this is before, and this is after. If you can see, this is the huge piece that took down the train trestles. And here you can see the size of it, and that they had to cut it up into pieces and carry it off. But these are like the seams that buckled. And here you can see how it slammed, and there's your rail track. Here's a building behind it. And if you notice, these windows are all busted out, but you can see that it also broke the windows in the upper floor as well. It could have been a lot worse. It traveled up to 35 miles an hour, but it kind of bounced off of Copp's Hill. And so if it hadn't done that, it would have gone a lot farther. So believe it or not, it could have been worse. Could have been worse if, you know, if it hit the tank, gas place. But after clean up, that's what it looked like. That's where the tank was. Looks like an atomic bomb went off. It took 4 days, and it cost, in today's money, it cost $100 million to clean it up. So let's go back to this wonderful industrial alcohol company who they took their time getting out there to see the damage. They claimed that it was a bomb that terrorists, they called them anarchists back then, but there was a group of terrorists who, yeah, they did bomb places and things like that. Well, they wanted to claim that that was the situation. So, but they had a very involved investigation, and it turned out that it was very clear that it was just a flawed steel. And that this was interesting, that the steel that went onto the tank was similar to that was used to build the Titanic. So after years of court battle, the judge ruled the people of Boston North End had an amazing attorney, and he really took this seriously and fought hard. And so he won against the big company, which was unusual at the time, because usually in those days, you know, the company always won out over the people. And so that tells you how good that the lawyer argued and just how devastating it was. But because of this terrible tragedy, it caused our tanks to be built much more safely. So again, there is the tank as it was, just put up very quickly. And now you have to have all kinds of venting and all kinds of permits and inspections and things like that. So hopefully that will never happen again. In the early 1900s, it would have been expected that the alcohol company could have judged it, but the judge said no. So the decision for how much the victims would be awarded, how much money they would get from the company, was up to the judge. And this trial took years for the civil thing. And so at any rate, he decided that deaths that were the most, those families got the most money. So he awarded $6,000 for people who were killed immediately, which today would be $600,000. And like, for instance, Maria's family. And then he gave $7,500 to people who suffered before they died, like George Leahy. So that would have been, I'm assuming that would have been like $750,000. The judge found the company guilty of negligence and ordered it to pay $300 million, which is equal to $4.5 million today. And there's a picture of the proceedings going on. So that was then, and this is now. This is Commercial Street. This is where it happened, and they took it and made it into a park with ball fields and nice things to do. This 6 Copp's Hill Terrace, that was the street address of Bridget's house, the house that got carried away and smashed. And I thought it would be interesting. I went on Google Earth. I wanted to see what that look like right now, that one place. And so Google Earth gave me exactly, I don't know, I'm sort of surprised that there's not a, I thought there would be a plaque or something there. And I see that there is something on that door, but it doesn't, I don't know, it might be, but I couldn't get an angle to see what was going on there. So anyway, and this was for an anniversary. I think it was the 100-year anniversary of the tragedy. And you could see people standing around where the perimeter of the tank was. So that's all I have for you. I really feel that it was such an amazing, and there's so much more I could say about it. Please, if you get a chance, check out this wonderful book, The Dark Tide. It is fascinating, and he really goes into a lot of more detail than I could possibly. Plus, he studied hundreds of thousands of all the court records. I didn't even touch really the court trial. So that's the second half of the book. So if you enjoyed this, I highly recommend checking out that book, but there are others out as well. And I thank you so much. I know some people, especially when they're younger, I know I did, I always thought that history was boring and it wasn't interesting, but it is fascinating. And it's especially fascinating if you're studying a time period and you take the time to find out what was going on in a particular year, what were the people like, what was life like. It brings history more to reality. And also, I highly encourage you to read historical fiction. That's also a great thing. At any rate, thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you will have a nice, safe day. Thank you.